I call this hearing to order. Today we will consider Senate Bill 4589, the Endangered Species Act amendments of 2020. I introduced this legislation to modernize and to strengthen the Endangered Species Act. It is the culmination of a collaboration with stakeholders from across the political spectrum, and it began 4 years ago. During my time as chairman, we have held 5 different hearings on how the Endangered Species Act needs to be reformed so it works better for wildlife and for people. It is clear legislation is needed to accomplish this goal. It was my intention to introduce a bill with the support of environmental and wildlife conservation organizations and a bipartisan group of senators. Our stakeholder feedback process made clear that at least one provision in my bill is a non-starter for those groups and for the committee's minority. It also made clear that the same provision is the top priority for my home state of Wyoming. The Endangered Species Act requires the Secretary of the Interior to monitor a species for at least 5 years after the species is fully recovered and delisted. My legislation would delay the ability of a federal court to overturn a delisting rule during this 5-year monitoring program. It doesn't eliminate anyone's rights to challenge a delisting rule in the federal court. It only delays such a lawsuit so states have an opportunity to prove that they can successfully manage the recovered species. Under my legislation, a recovered species is still protected during that 5-year post-delisting monitoring period. They're still protected by state regulations and a state management plan, and by the Secretary's authority to relist the species if its condition deteriorates. These changes to the Endangered Species Act are critical for Wyoming, for Montana, for Idaho, and for other states. This point was highlighted at a hearing this committee held earlier this month. The grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is fully recovered. That's not just me saying it. President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump all agree. And each of those administrations have tried to delist the species. Yet, activist federal judges have repeatedly intervened to overturn these delisting rules. The decades-long commitment of time and resources by states and stakeholders simply cannot continue if the good work to recover the grizzly bear is ignored by activist courts. I understand that this provision ensures some stakeholders won't support my bill. However, it is an issue that needs to be addressed if we are to improve the Endangered Species Act. Many other concepts and provisions in the bill have received positive feedback and support from environmental and wildlife conservation groups. They include the parts of the bill that reauthorize the Endangered Species Act for the first time in almost 30 years, substantially increasing the funding authorization and focusing money on recovery of species, elevating the role of states in implementing the Act, ensuring non-governmental stakeholders have a clearer voice in recovery and in implementing planning, providing regulatory certainty to incentivize investment in conservation and recovery activities, and prioritizing resources for species that are most in need. Stakeholders have also sought a significant additional funding stream for wildlife conservation. I continue to be open to exploring this possibility. The funding levels must be reasonable, justified, and paid for. They must also be part of a bill that modernizes the Endangered Species Act. Since the Endangered Species Act was signed into law, fewer than 3% of listed species have been recovered and delisted. This is a failure, not a success. We must do more than just list species and leave them on life support. We need to see them recovered and delisted. The Endangered Species Act amendments of 2020 will go a long way to achieving this goal. Now, I want to thank all of the stakeholders who participated in bringing the legislation to this point, including those stakeholders who currently cannot support the bill. Now, I hope to continue to work to find a viable pathway for this legislation as we move into the 117th Congress. I'd now like to turn to Ranking Member Carper for his opening statement.